Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we begin with not one, but two item descriptions that form a sequence. Bud of a Deathblood Flower, one of the materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. Pale vegetation that is said to bud in deathblood in abandoned places. It quietly grows in the vicinity of death and is ultimately said to flower. Fortunately, we can see what that looks like right now by moving on to the next description. Large flowered deathblood flower, one of the materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. Pale vegetation that is said to bud in deathblood in abandoned places. But that which has opened into a large flower is a pure red other shore flower. As you can see, here we have the two final pieces in a sequence of items based on the life cycle of a flower. The first shows the plant as a sprout. The second features it in a more developed state with pronounced but still closed flower buds, and the last depicts the flower in full bloom. Straightforward as this may seem, though, I believe we're actually looking at an intriguing example of in-game context strong enough to compensate for a potential issue with the translated item names. To get a better sense of this, let's consider the name of the second item in the sequence on its own. In Japanese, the operative term is tsubomi, or bud, while in the official translation, the word is bulb. I'm guessing that the translator was trying to call to mind the bulbous shape of flower buds. But the trouble is, in the worlds of gardening and botany, the word bulb has a different meaning. It refers to the underground food storage organ certain plants and flowers grow from. If you were to buy a tulip bulb, for example, you would probably not be purchasing a tulip with an unopened flower, but one in an earlier stage of development meant to be planted in your garden. As a standalone translation, then, Coldblood Flower bulb doesn't seem like a great fit for Shiketsubana no Tsubomi, at least not based on this somewhat specialized understanding of the word bulb. So why might the translators have settled on this anyway? Well, this is where we need to bring the item sequence back in, because once we do, the situation immediately starts to look more understandable. If we consider the operative Japanese term for the first item in question, mebae, we'll see that one of the definitions for it in a common Japanese to English dictionary is actually bud. For this reason, if you go back to Translationborne 44, you can see that I pass right over the item name when discussing that particular translation, and instead focus on the atmospheric wording choice in the official English description. More importantly though, this could explain how the official English names for these items came about, since I can easily imagine seeing two different Japanese terms that can mean bud and wanting to differentiate them. I do think that changing the name of the first item in the sequence to Coldblood Flower Sprout, so the second could be the Coldblood Flower Bud, would have been more in line with plant-specific terminology, but that's not actually why I brought all of this up. What I really find fascinating about this situation, as I said at the outset, is how the underlying context from the game is so strong that this consideration of technical terminology hardly makes much difference. I don't know about you, but until I started looking into these item names in detail, I never once thought to question the sequence because I could see the underlying logic. It was clear enough from the images, the descriptions, and even the names that these items were meant to depict different stages in the development of a flower, with those closer to it blooming representing greater ritual potency. That makes this a somewhat unorthodox example of a point I've repeatedly brought up in this series, which is that what really matters in translation is the expression of the core idea. After all, here the point comes through despite the English words arguably being less than ideal. Fortunately, we can also see some more positive examples of this principle at work in the descriptions of these same items. As I've mentioned before, they all do a great job evoking a sense of forlorn loss, but arguably the most prominent example of a translation that preserves the underlying idea of the Japanese comes from the blooming Coldblood Flower. It's described as Stygian, which I think is an elegant way of capturing the underlying sentiment of the Japanese. There, the corresponding descriptor is higan, which is a fairly complicated concept that requires some interpretation to make sense of. Taken by itself, higan is associated with the Japanese Buddhist holiday surrounding the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, but its Buddhist roots run deeper still. Apparently, it's a term meant to be a meaning-based translation of the Sanskrit word paramita, which references nirvana as a place on a far shore, separated from the cycle of death and rebirth by a metaphorical river of worldly desires. This is why the kanji involved literally mean that over there and shore. Crucially though, this Buddhist concept seems to have mixed over time with Japanese traditions surrounding the Sanzu River, a mythical river crossed by the dead on their way to the afterlife. This brings us back to the term Stygian, which is the English word for something of or related to the river Styx, another mythical river crossed by the dead on their way to the afterlife. The end result is that both in English and Japanese, this flower is described using a term that ties it by association to a mythical borderline between the lands of the living and the dead. When we further consider how it's a form of life that grows from cold blood, which is literally the blood of the dead, the idea that it would symbolically straddle these two states seems perfectly appropriate. So I'm glad the official translation was able to find a similar cultural reference to bring this meaning across. Considering Bloodborne's associations between blood echoes and life after death, I think it's a particularly important idea to preserve. But now that we've examined a set of chalice materials in such detail, it only seems fitting that we next turn our attention to a holy chalice. Great Chalice of Isz, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. Great chalices, in particular, are things which connect to hidden portions of the ruins. The Isz Great Chalice, which became a cornerstone of the high-level healing church faction, the Holy Song Troupe, was the first great chalice brought to the surface since Bergenworth, and ultimately granted them audience with Ebrietas. Okay, clearly this item includes some lore-relevant information in its description, but before we get to that, there are a few other aspects of the translation that I want to examine. First, there are some lessons I think we can learn from looking at the item name, and second, I want to revisit the chalice template I last discussed back in Translationborne 57, to see how well it holds up in the case of both this particular chalice and the others related to Isz. Only then do I intend to take a combined look at the lore implications of these descriptions. So first things first, let's turn to some of the lessons we can learn from the translation choices that went into this item name. You probably noticed that in my more literal reading, I went with the transliteration Isz as the name for the region tied to this chalice, rather than relying on a more intuitive reading of the official translation spelling of Isz. Longtime viewers will probably recall that I'm fascinated by the logic behind how the katakana-based pronunciations of Japanese terms get treated when translated, particularly when said terms are completely fictional. Well, this case is no exception, so I've deliberately gone with a pronunciation of the Japanese that highlights the difference from the official term. The thing is, if the pronunciation were to be kept as Izu, particularly if spelled Izu like most transliterations from katakana would have it, this region's name may call to mind the real-world Izu Peninsula in Japan. That association could work against the game's positioning this as a hidden region of the underground labyrinth, as well as Bloodborne's ties to Lovecraftian fiction. For both of these reasons, you probably don't want players to learn about the hidden land of Izu and think, oh, like in Japan. Thus, the official translator's decision to use the ISZ spelling kills two birds with one stone. It eliminates the potential for an association with a real-world place name, and it leverages an unusual letter combination to fit with the game's Lovecraftian themes. What's more, since the final U sound at the end of a katakana-based word is often meant to be dropped, the official translation still fits with the general logic of what the katakana may be intended to represent. I find this to be a fitting and atmospheric choice. While this accounts for the katakana, though, there's still the question of how to account for the kanji used in the name of this chalice. How has this become the Great Isz Chalice as opposed to the Izu Great Chalice? Well, this is another case where I've deliberately gone with an unnatural wording in my literal rendering, specifically to highlight how the official translation prioritizes natural English phrasing. Taken by itself, the name Great Isz Chalice could be misunderstood as the Chalice of Great Isz, whereas the phrase Great Chalice of Isz makes it clear that the chalice itself is what's great. This also mirrors the linguistic construction of the Japanese, which has formed a single word by taking the kanji for big or great and adding it to the two kanji that make up the term holy chalice. This gives the literal construction another potential advantage in that it's easier to see the singular concept of a great chalice if the whole thing is a single word. By contrast, Great Isz chalice sounds more natural, and since the only real importance behind the term great chalice is that it conveys the underlying singularity of the concept, the translator's explanation of this idea in the description means they don't have to rely on the title alone to get this across. This leads us to two big takeaways. First, sometimes it's okay to prioritize a natural-sounding name over a more descriptive one. And second, as we've seen before, relying on additional contextual information can be helpful when translating. Now that we've started looking into the description, though, I think it's time we stopped to consider the overall form of this text. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen a lot of formulaic writing on these chalices in the past, so much so that I've come up with a broad template for how their descriptions tend to be structured, and I think it's worth examining how well this particular one fits the pattern. Since this is both the first great chalice we've found and the first chalice connected to the land of Isz, it wouldn't be strange to find some variety here. And sure enough, that's what we see. Well, the first line is the standard one for preset Chalice Dungeons about breaking a single labyrinth seal. But the second line notably fits a pattern we've mostly seen on root chalices, when it describes the special way this category of chalice connects to the underground ruins. It's a subtle touch, but one that I think reinforces the idea that great chalices form their own unique subtype of chalice. That makes this an interesting case where the form of the chalice description helps underline the meaning of the text, and it's something I think works in both languages, though it's arguably a little easier to spot in the Japanese formatting. Nor is that the only thing that sets this chalice apart. Aside from the first Tumaru chalice, which explains how to perform a chalice ritual and encourages players to venture into the Chalice Dungeons, the other initial chalices all conclude with some information on the region they're linked to. The Great Isz chalice, though, details its own history, explicitly identifying itself as one of the few chalices brought to the surface in the modern era. So even as it fits the mold of conveying unique information, this chalice really stands out. The other Isz chalices, by contrast, are a little more conventional. All-encompassing Chalice of Izu. One of the all-encompassing holy chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. Holy Chalice Dungeons, with their seals broken by an all-encompassing holy chalice ritual, are known for changing their form every time a ritual is performed. According to the Holy Song Troupe, the land of Izu is in direct contact with outer space. They say that therefore the higher rank ones once gained transcendent thoughts. As you can see via this comparison to the Hintertomb root chalice, the opening sections are the same as those on most root chalices. What's more, the sinister root chalice fits what I've been calling the sinister variant as well, right down to the standard note about offline play that's unique to that subset of chalices. Furthermore, as we've also seen before, there's a bit of new information concerning the region in question that's shared between the root chalice and the sinister root chalice. In terms of the structure of their descriptions then, the Isz root chalice and the sinister Isz root chalice are pretty much in line with the standard chalice template. Their names, however, highlight something interesting. You may recall that I've mentioned before how unusual it is for the name of a chalice to drop information. Typically, it's an exclusively additive process, listing first whether a chalice is sinister, followed by the depth of the chalice, then its region, whether or not it's a root chalice, and finally, the word chalice. However, here we've gone from the Great Isz chalice to the Isz root chalice and the sinister Isz root chalice, dropping the word great. The same thing happens in Japanese, with the dai dropping out of the term dai seihai, confirming that the other two chalices associated with Isz are regular chalices, not great ones. Given what we know about great chalices and how they connect to secret parts of the underground ruins, though, this is a shift that makes sense to me. After all, if root chalices change the labyrinth's form every time they're used in a chalice ritual, they can't reliably connect to these hidden regions of the ruins, meaning that only preset chalices can truly be classified as great chalices. Now, I'm not entirely sure if my analysis of that underlying logic is accurate, but if so, that's a very subtle point to convey purely through item naming conventions, so I appreciate that the translators recreated it in English. Really, I think they've done an admirable job translating these items on the whole. There are lots of nice touches on display, such as the idea that the land of Isz lies in contact with the cosmos, as opposed to the more literal concept of it touching outer space. By using a more mystical term, what could otherwise read as nonsense becomes a statement tied to the choir's beliefs that the cosmos might be very near us, possibly even penetrating into the underground ruins. Another choice I appreciate in this vein actually comes from the Great Isz chalice, where the official translation speaks of deeper reaches of the labyrinth. This works with the already established context of lower regions in the Tomb of the Gods being of greater significance, in a way that a more literal, secret places of the ruins doesn't. Now, arguably, this does make it a little harder to spot why root chalices can't be great chalices in English, since the connection to a hidden area is more exclusive to fixed chalices than a deeper one. But I appreciate the logic tying back to how the Chalice Dungeons generally work nonetheless. That finally brings us to the lore for these items though, where intriguingly, perhaps the most interesting thing about the translation of the Great Isz chalice has more to do with the translation of other item descriptions than the Great Isz chalice itself. What do I mean by this? Well, it has to do with one potential way to parse Bloodborne's lore. I've mentioned this before, but it's possible to interpret the Japanese phrasing of a number of different item descriptions as saying that the Byrgenwerth scholars encountered Ebriatis in the underground labyrinth. Basically, if we take the phrase nushi ni shitagatte on the Graveguard set to mean that Willem's servants accompanied him into the underground ruins, rather than to mean that they followed his orders, and then read their encounter with the Eldritch Truth as a meeting with a Great One, that gets us most of the way there. Then there's the Augur of Ebriatis, the opening lines of which can be understood to mean it's a vestige of the Eldritch Truth Byrgenwerth encountered. Furthermore, the final section of this description mentions that this chance encounter began the inquiry into the cosmos from within the labyrinth, and is connected to the choir. As a result, reading that the Great Isz chalice was the first great chalice brought to the surface since Byrgenwerth, confirming by implication that Byrgenwerth had access to a great chalice, takes on additional significance in this theory. Of course, that we know this chalice led the choir to find Ebriatis and became the cornerstone of the group can't be ignored either, especially since this could also explain how Byrgenwerth's chance encounter in the labyrinth could tie in with the choir as an organization. What lineage could be clearer than if Byrgenwerth had this great chalice, encountered Ebriatis, began exploring the ruins, then finally lost the chalice for a time until it and Ebriatis were rediscovered by the choir. While I personally find this evidence persuasive though, and I haven't even mentioned some of the supplemental pieces, it's important to remember when evaluating the translation that each of these interpretations could technically be taken another way. Each piece of evidence has some level of ambiguity to it, resulting in an interesting situation where there's simply a wider possibility space for interpretation in Japanese than in the English text. And either way, the actual translation of the Great Isz chalice itself seems to have been handled well. Thus, the issue with how it fits into the lore mostly concerns other items. Of course, this is hardly the only instance where Bloodborne's unusual way of presenting its lore makes translating it a challenge. For instance, take this boss I'm fighting and dying to. It's been the subject of much speculation, with at least two vastly different theories that I know of that afford it a central role in the game's lore. And it's also a case where the translation of its name could be taken many different ways. That makes this boss name the perfect subject for an extended look at how contextual information, lore interpretation, and translation can interact. To appreciate this, I want to start by looking purely at the text, then bring in various other aspects of the game, including the aforementioned lore theories, to see how they could influence our perception of the translation. Once that's done, I'll have a few concluding thoughts to offer on something I've come to see as one of the main through lines of this whole series: the impact the process behind a translation can have on its result, because I think that has a lot of relevance to this discussion. Before we get there though, let's consider the actual text in question. Literally, it works out to something like Principle 1 of Beast Blood, and most of those terms are pretty straightforward. We have the kanji for beast in combination with the kanji for blood to form a single concept. This is followed by the particle no, which in this case functions like the English word of in applying the preceding idea of beast blood to the final word. However, this is where things get complicated. To start with, the pronunciation for that final term is unclear. In my experience, this kanji by itself is most commonly read either as aruji or nushi, though there are at least two other readings I've been able to find for it in a dictionary. Oh, and if this discussion sounds familiar, that's because I covered this same term back when talking about the boss name for Mikolash, Host of the Nightmare. As you may also recall from that discussion, host is one possible idea this kanji can express, though more in the sense of the host at a party rather than the host of a parasite. Really, a lot of the associations this term has relate to being the chief figure of something, and many of the other senses of the word don't seem to me like they'd apply to this boss, which is why I've gone with Principal One as my literal rendering. So, based on the Japanese wording, it sounds like this boss is in some sort of crucial or commanding position in regard to beast blood. Given that core idea, let's now consider the official translation of Bloodletting Beast. I have to say, that choice really surprised me when I first put the two languages side by side. After all, the Japanese text doesn't include anything about bloodletting, and the word beast only shows up in the phrase beast blood. Over time, though, I've come to appreciate this translation more, provided of course that it was a deliberate choice and not one of the odd cases we've seen of outdated English text. That's because tying this boss to the concept of bloodletting leads to a few interesting outcomes. For one thing, it brings in a reference to an old medical procedure that could allow us to understand this beast as either having actually been tied to the profession, or serving as a parody of it, with both possibilities being relevant to Bloodborne. What's more, it introduces some ambiguity as to whether the blood being let by this beast is supposed to be that of others or its own. Finally, while I admit there's an interpretive leap required here, I do think the term introduces some idea of the beast having mastery over blood in order to let it. Whatever you might think of the official translation though, I want to keep both it and the idea behind the original Japanese in mind as I introduce some further information about how this boss fits into the game alongside some lore theories. There are 3 different ways I'm aware of to reconcile the existence of this enemy with the game's lore. One method is to consider it fairly unexceptional. Another is to view it as Lawrence's final fate, and the third is to take it as revealing the true nature of the blood. So let's go through each interpretation and see how our perception of the boss's name changes. You might think that the first of these perspectives, that this enemy isn't particularly special, doesn't do much to change things, but I think it's possible that having more context around this fight could provide some support for the official translation. That's because there's a specific attack that involves this boss lowering itself onto all fours and shaking itself so that blood shoots out of its open wound towards us, making it quite literally a beast that lets its own blood. Before we get too carried away by this idea though, it's important to recognize that the version of this boss that I'm currently fighting isn't the only one. There are actually 2 encounters with it spread out over the course of the preset Chalice Dungeons, and the first time players face this beast, it notably still has a head. More importantly for this discussion though, it's only the second headless version that performs the bloodletting attack. To me, that makes it seem less likely that we can trace the explanation for this boss's name to how one version of it occasionally uses its blood as a weapon. Still, I think it's worth considering how a little in-game context has the potential to make what seemed like an odd translation choice appear to be a perfectly sensible one. With that in mind then, let's see what happens when we start introducing some more involved lore theories, beginning with the idea that this is Lawrence's final fate. To give a brief rundown of the theory, much of the evidence for it is visual and contextual. Remember how I mentioned you first fight this beast with a head? Well, even that version of the boss has sustained damage to its skull, and there are aspects of both the overall shape of the skull and its wound that arguably line up better with the one on the altar of the Grand Cathedral than the head of a cleric beast. What's more, the story of this beast seems to be one of exploring the Chalice Dungeons until it loses its head, which at least metaphorically lines up with what we know about Lawrence. Of course, this theory also has its detractors. For one thing, the visuals of the 2 skulls don't line up perfectly. For another, with the release of the DLC, there's now an explicit boss fight against a version of Lawrence. Admittedly, this could be understood as a struggle against Lawrence's spirit, with the Chalice Dungeon version featuring his physical body. But the mere existence of the DLC boss fight does arguably reduce the need to read Lawrence's story onto a Chalice Dungeon boss. Whether you like this interpretation or not though, I think it's interesting to see how well both the Japanese and English versions of the boss name work with it. In terms of the Japanese, the idea of Lawrence as the chief figure in regards to beast blood fits the lore perfectly. After all, he's the one responsible for founding the Healing Church, which we know to be deeply interested in all varieties of blood. Meanwhile, the official translation of Bloodletting Beast could also be taken as an identification of Lawrence's role in blood-related medical practices. it's not even that much of a stretch, since as we know from acquiring vials of others' blood throughout the game, blood healing involves first letting and then consuming people's blood. There could even be some clever wordplay at work, with the name functioning both as a term of disparagement and a literal description of Lawrence as a beast. So if you accept this particular lore theory, you may have reason to view the translation of Bloodletting Beast in an even more positive light than if all you had to go on was the one blood-based attack. But not all the interpretations I've seen that involve this boss name work out in favor of the English translation. One Japanese theory I've been pointed to in the past associates the beastly scourge with parasites in the blood. It's an idea that could line up with what we learn about the vermin we can find and crush by joining the League. After all, these strange creatures are literally said to be the root of man's stagnation, and perhaps we can associate the concept of stagnation with sickness, due to the sorts of things that develop in stagnant water. By extension, what if these centipede-like vermin could be understood as integrally tied to infected blood? Well, it could make sense of the last surprise this boss has in store for us. As you can see, it actually has something that looks like a parasite shoot out of its neck to become its head partway through the fight. Thus, the idea is that this boss name constitutes part of a big reveal, where in the first fight we're not meant to understand what it means, but when we see the bug-like vermin take the place of the boss's head in the second fight, we're supposed to realize that this vermin-like parasite is the true principal figure in regards to beast blood. That's important, because even if we interpret the official translation as a similar reference to the parasite as a sort of beast that lets the blood of its host, the fact that there's nothing to tie that parasite to beast blood obscures the connection to vermin and the nature of the beastly scourge, at least in this version of the lore. As I said earlier, I think this particular theory works best in Japanese, especially since it was written in Japanese and encompasses not just this boss name, but the wide category of creatures that could fit the term mushi, used for vermin, as well as the Japanese idea of the stagnation these beings are said to cause. But to return to the subject of the boss name, I've now covered one lore theory that doesn't really line up with the official translation, one that lines up surprisingly well, and another that's fairly neutral. So it seems like the question of whether you can consider this a good translation or not depends to some extent on your interpretation of the game. Of course, the developers and the official translators probably had their own influences on why they called this boss what they did, but we don't know what those are. And this is where I want to come back to the idea of how important the translation process is to its result. Even ignoring the other instances we've seen of this, such as the discrepancies between the US English and British English text, consider how the following questions could influence our understanding of this boss name. Were the translators in direct contact with the developers when translating the boss names? If not, could they at least ask about the reasoning behind what this boss was called? Supposing they could, were the devs too busy to answer? These are all reasonable questions to ask of the process, but unlike my hard-won victory, the answers aren't clear. And obviously, if the translators arrived at this name based on contextual information from the developers, that makes a huge difference in how we should evaluate it. Much like our interpretation of the in-game lore then, our understanding of the behind-the-scenes process plays a role in shaping what we make of translation choices, something worth bearing in mind when doing translation analysis. And that, I believe, is a good note to go out on. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share about anything I touched on in this episode, or if you have any other feedback for me, please let me know. Alternatively, if you want to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, check out the Translationborne Index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.